The chandelier above the ballroom must have cost more than Elena would earn in 10 years. She looked up at it for just a second, the crystals catching light and throwing tiny rainbows across the ceiling. Then she heard someone snap their fingers, and she remembered where she was. She wasn't a guest here. She was the help. Elena Vasquez was 28 years old, and tonight she was working her third double shift this week at the Ridgemont Country Club. The place was the kind of fancy that made you feel small just by walking through the doors. Everything was white marble and gold trim. The guests wore watches that cost more than cars, and they talked about summer homes the way normal people talked about weekend plans. Tonight was a special event. Some big real estate company had just closed a deal worth over $1 billion, and the owner was throwing himself a party to celebrate. His name was Richard Harrington, and from the moment Elena saw him, she knew he was the kind of man who had never heard the word no in his entire life. He stood in the center of the room like he owned it, which, technically, he did. He had rented out the entire venue for the night. His suit probably cost more than Elena's rent for 6 months, and he laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, just because people expected him to laugh. Everyone around him smiled and nodded and agreed with everything he said. That's what money does. It makes people pretend you're interesting even when you're not. Elena moved through the crowd carrying a tray of champagne glasses. Her feet hurt, her back ached. She had been on her feet since 6 in the morning, first at the diner across town, then here. She had maybe 4 hours of sleep the night before, and she would be lucky to get the same tonight. But she didn't complain. She never complained. There was no point. Complaining didn't pay the bills. Complaining didn't make the debt collectors stop calling. Complaining didn't bring her mother back. Her mother had passed away 2 years ago after a long battle with cancer. The medical bills had piled up like a mountain Elena couldn't see the top of. Even with insurance, even with everything they tried, the costs just kept coming. And when her mother finally closed her eyes for the last time, she left behind nothing but love, memories, and a debt that would take Elena another decade to pay off. So Elena worked. She worked at the diner in the mornings. She cleaned houses in the afternoons when she could find clients. And at night, she picked up catering shifts at places like this, where rich people drank champagne and pretended the rest of the world didn't exist. She moved carefully between the guests, offering drinks with a polite smile. Most of them didn't even look at her. To them, she was invisible, just another person in a black and white uniform, part of the background, like the furniture or the flower arrangements. That was fine with Elena. Invisible meant safe. Invisible meant no trouble. But trouble found her anyway. It happened near the grand piano. There was a beautiful Steinway sitting in the corner of the ballroom, shiny and black, probably worth more than everything Elena had ever owned combined. Nobody was playing it. It was just there for decoration, like everything else in this place. Elena was walking past it when someone stepped backward without looking. She tried to move out of the way, but her tray tilted. Just slightly. Just enough for a few drops of champagne to splash out of one of the glasses. The drops landed on the sleeve of Richard Harrington's jacket. Time seemed to stop. Elena felt her heart freeze in her chest. She looked at the tiny wet spots on his sleeve, then up at his face. His expression changed from surprise to annoyance, to something much worse, something cold and cruel. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was loud enough that people nearby turned to look. "I'm so sorry, sir," Elena said quickly. "It was an accident. Please, let me get you a napkin." "An accident?" Richard repeated the word like it was something disgusting. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" "Of course you don't. You probably don't make in a year what I spent on this jacket." Elena felt her face grow hot. People were staring now. A circle was forming around them, guests watching like this was some kind of show put on for their entertainment. "I'm very sorry," Elena said again, keeping her voice steady even though her hands were shaking. "I can have it dry cleaned. I'll pay for it myself." Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You'll pay for it? With what? Your tips?" He looked around at his guests, inviting them to share in the joke. A few of them chuckled nervously. Elena's manager, a thin man named Mr. Pearson, appeared at her side. His face was pale. "Mr. Harrington, I am so sorry. This will be handled immediately." Elena apologized to Mr. Harrington and returned to the kitchen. "She already apologized," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. "Several times. It's getting boring." He looked at Elena with those cold eyes, and something shifted in his expression. He had noticed the piano behind her. A small smile crept onto his face, the kind of smile that made Elena's stomach turn. "You know what?" Richard said slowly. "I think our little waitress here should make it up to us. Entertain us a little." He gestured toward the piano. "Go on. Play something." "Go." Elena blinked. "Excuse me?" "The piano," Richard said, speaking slowly like she was stupid. "Play it. Give us a show. Unless pushing buttons on a cash register is the limit of your abilities." More laughter from the crowd now, louder this time, more confident. They had permission to mock her, and they were taking it. Elena stood there, frozen. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what she would do, waiting to see her fail, waiting to laugh at the poor waitress who didn't know her place. Mr. Pearson grabbed her arm gently. "Elena, just go back to the kitchen. I'll handle this." But Elena didn't move. She was looking at the piano. That beautiful, shiny piano that nobody here appreciated. Nobody here understood. To them, it was just expensive furniture. A status symbol, something to show off. But to Elena, a piano was something else entirely. She thought about her mother. Her mother, who had been a piano teacher back in Venezuela, before they came to America, before everything fell apart. Her mother, who had spent years teaching Elena to play, sitting beside her on the bench for hours, guiding her small fingers across the keys. Her mother, who always said that music was a gift that nobody could ever take away from you. Elena hadn't touched a piano in almost 10 years. Not since her mother got sick. Not since she had to drop out of music school and start working to pay the bills. She had buried that part of herself so deep she almost forgot it existed. But standing there, with all those cruel eyes watching her, with Richard Harrington smirking like he had already won, something inside Elena began to wake up. She looked at Mr. Pearson, then at Richard, then at the piano. "Any requests?" she asked quietly. The room went silent. Richard's smirk faltered for just a second, then came back stronger. He thought she was joking. He thought she was going to embarrass herself and give everyone an even bigger laugh. "Surprise me," he said, gesturing toward the piano like he was throwing scraps to a dog. Elena set down her tray. She reached behind her back and untied her apron, folding it neatly and placing it on a nearby table. Then, without another word, she walked toward the piano and sat down on the bench. The whispers started immediately. People pulled out their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be a disaster, ready to capture the moment a foolish waitress humiliated herself in front of the city's elite. Elena placed her fingers on the keys. They felt cool and familiar, like greeting an old friend after years apart. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, and then she began to play. The first note cut through the room like a knife through silk. It was soft, almost fragile, but it carried a weight that made people stop mid-conversation. The second note followed, then the third, and suddenly the whispers died completely. Elena was playing Chopin. Ballade? No. 1-inch G minor. It was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. The kind of music that professional pianists spent years perfecting. The kind of music that separated those who simply played piano from those who truly understood it. Her fingers moved across the keys like water flowing over stones. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was as if the piano had been waiting for her all night, and now that she had finally arrived, it was singing. In the crowd, a woman holding a champagne glass felt her hand begin to tremble. A man in his 60s, who had studied classical music in his youth, felt tears forming in his eyes, without understanding why. A young couple who had been taking selfies all night slowly lowered their phones and simply listened. Richard Harrington stood frozen in place. The smirk had fallen off his face like a mask that no longer fit. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground open up beneath his feet. Elena didn't see any of this. Her eyes were closed, and she was somewhere else entirely. She was back in the small apartment in Caracas where she grew up, sitting on a wooden bench that wobbled slightly because one leg was shorter than the others. Her mother was beside her, humming along to the melody, her warm hand occasionally reaching over to correct Elena's posture or guide her fingers to the right position. "Feel the music, mija," her mother would say. "Don't just play it. Feel it. Let it tell you what it wants to be." Elena had been 7 years old when she first touched a piano. By the time she was 10, her teachers said she was gifted. By 12, they said she was extraordinary. By 15, she had won every competition in her country and was being invited to perform internationally. When she was 17, she received a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious music schools in America. Her mother cried for 3 days straight. Not from sadness, but from joy. All those years of sacrifice, all those extra jobs her mother had worked to afford lessons in sheet music, and eventually a second-hand piano that took up half their living room, it had all been worth it. Elena moved to New York with nothing but a suitcase and a dream. For 2 years, she studied under some of the greatest piano teachers in the world. Her professors said she had something special, something that couldn't be taught. They said she played with her soul, not just her hands. And then her mother got sick. The diagnosis came like a punch to the stomach. Stage 3, cancer. The doctors said they could fight it, but the treatment would be expensive. Elena's scholarship covered her tuition, but it didn't cover medical bills for family members in another country. So Elena made a choice. She dropped out of school, got a job, and sent every dollar she could back home. She worked double shifts, triple shifts, whatever it took. She stopped playing piano because every time she sat down at a keyboard, she thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed, and her fingers refused to move. Her mother fought for 3 years. 3 years of hope and despair, of good days and terrible nights, of phone calls that Elena dreaded answering. In the end, it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. After her mother passed, Elena couldn't even look at a piano without feeling like her chest was being crushed. So she buried that part of herself. She told herself that chapter of her life was over. She was a waitress now, a cleaner, a nobody. The girl who could have been a concert pianist was gone. But sitting here, in this ridiculous ballroom full of people who had tried to humiliate her, Elena realized something. That girl wasn't gone. She had just been sleeping, and now, finally, she was waking up. The music grew more intense. Elena's fingers flew across the keys, pulling sounds from the piano that seemed impossible. The melody rose and fell like waves in a storm, sometimes crashing with fury, sometimes retreating to a whisper so soft you had to hold your breath to hear it. People in the crowd had started recording with their phones, but not to mock her anymore. They recorded because they understood they were witnessing something rare, something that might never happen again. A few of them wiped their eyes, surprised to find they were crying. Near the back of the room, a woman in her early 50s watched with particular intensity. Her name was Catherine Joe, and she was not supposed to be at this party. She had come as a favor to an old friend, expecting nothing more than mediocre conversation and overpriced wine. But now, she stood completely still, barely breathing. Catherine had spent 30 years in the classical music world. She had discovered talents, launched careers, and helped build some of the most successful concert pianists of the last generation. She knew, better than almost anyone, what true musical genius looked like, and she was looking at it right now. This waitress, this young woman in a stained uniform with tired eyes and rough hands, was playing at a level Catherine had only seen a handful of times in her entire career. The technique was flawless, yes, but that wasn't what made Catherine's heart race. It was the emotion. The raw, unfiltered pain and beauty pouring out of every note. You couldn't teach that. You couldn't fake it. It came from somewhere deep inside. From a place that most people spent their whole lives trying to protect. Elena reached the final movement of the piece. Her body swayed slightly with the music, her face a mask of concentration and release. Tears were streaming down her cheeks now. But she didn't notice. She was too far gone, too deep inside the music to care about anything else. The last notes rang out, hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Then, silence. Complete, total silence. Elena opened her eyes. For a moment, she seemed confused, like she had forgotten where she was. Then, reality came flooding back. The ballroom. The party. The cruel man who had tried to embarrass her. She looked out at the crowd and saw something she didn't expect. They were standing. All of them. Every single person in that room was on their feet. And they were clapping. Not the polite, scattered applause you give when you're being nice. This was thunderous. This was the kind of applause that shakes the walls and fills your chest with sound. Elena sat frozen on the piano bench, unable to process what was happening. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. Mr. Pearson, her manager, stood near the kitchen door with his mouth hanging open. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. Richard Harrington was still in the same spot where Elena had left him, but something had changed. His face was pale, his confident posture gone. He looked smaller somehow, like the air had been let out of him. For the first time all night, he had nothing to say. The applause went on and on. People were cheering now, calling out words like, incredible and amazing, and who is she? A few guests approached the piano, trying to get closer, trying to ask Elena questions, but she couldn't hear them over the ringing in her ears. And then, through the crowd, Catherine Jo began to walk forward. She moved slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving Elena's face. Elena watched her approach, not knowing who this woman was or what she wanted. All she knew was that something had shifted tonight. Something big. She had sat down at that piano, expecting nothing. Maybe she had wanted to prove a point. Or maybe she had just wanted to feel close to her mother again. If only for a few minutes. But whatever her reasons, she understood now that there was no going back. The girl who played piano had returned, and the whole room had seen her. The applause was still echoing through the ballroom when Catherine Jo reached the piano. She didn't push through the crowd like everyone else. She moved with a calm patience that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted without having to rush. Elena watched her approach, still trying to catch her breath. Her fingers were tingling, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She hadn't played like that in years. She hadn't felt like that in years. That was Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Catherine said when she finally stood in front of Elena. It wasn't a question. You played it in G minor, the original key. Most performers transpose it to make certain passages easier. You didn't. Elena blinked. It didn't feel right to change it. Catherine smiled. It was a small smile. The kind that suggested she was impressed but didn't want to show it too easily. Where did you study? I didn't finish, Elena said quietly. I had to leave. That's not what I asked. Elena hesitated. The crowd around them was still buzzing, people whispering and pointing, phones still recording. She felt exposed, like a wound that had been covered for years, was suddenly open for everyone to see. The Manhattan Conservatory, she finally said. I was there for 2 years before I dropped out. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly. The Manhattan Conservatory was one of the most selective music schools in the country. Getting in was almost impossible. Getting a full scholarship, which Catherine suspected this young woman must have had, was even harder. Why did you leave? Elena looked down at her hands. They were the hands of someone who worked hard. Rough skin, short nails, small scars from kitchen accidents and cleaning chemicals. Not the hands of a concert pianist. My mother got sick, she said. I had to work. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Around them, the party was slowly returning to normal. Guests were going back to their conversations, though they kept glancing at Elena like she might start playing again at any moment. The waiters had resumed their rounds, carefully avoiding the area near the piano. What's your name? Catherine asked. Elena. Elena Vasquez. Catherine reached into her small purse and pulled out a business card. It was simple, elegant. Just a name and a phone number on thick cream-colored paper. "My name is Catherine Ju," she said, handing the card to Elena. "I work with the New York Philharmonic. I also run a foundation that helps young musicians develop their careers." Elena took the card but didn't look at it. She was staring at Catherine like she was speaking a foreign language. "I don't understand," Elena said. "I think you do." Catherine's voice was gentle but firm. "You have a gift. A real gift. The kind that comes along once in a generation. Maybe less, and you're wasting it carrying champagne for people who couldn't tell Chopin from a car alarm." Elena felt something twist in her chest. Part of her wanted to believe what this woman was saying. But another part, the part that had learned to survive by keeping expectations low, pushed back hard. "That was a long time ago," Elena said. "I'm not that person anymore. I'm just a waitress." "You were never just a waitress," Catherine said. "You were a musician who happened to be waiting tables. There's a difference." Before Elena could respond, a commotion near the center of the room caught their attention. Richard Harrington was surrounded by a group of guests, all of them talking at once. His face was red, and he kept shaking his head like he was trying to deny something. Elena couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could guess. The videos were already spreading. She had seen at least a dozen phones recording her performance. By tomorrow, the whole thing would be online. The arrogant billionaire who tried to humiliate a waitress, only to discover she was a piano genius. It was exactly the kind of story the internet loved. Richard caught Elena looking at him. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Elena expected to see anger in his face, or maybe embarrassment. But what she saw was something else, something that almost looked like fear. He looked away first. "He's going to have a difficult week," Catherine observed, following Elena's gaze. "The internet doesn't forgive moments like that." Elena shook her head. "I didn't do this to embarrass him." "I know. That's what makes it even better." Catherine smiled again. Warmer this time. "You didn't play to prove him wrong. You played because you couldn't help it. Because the music was inside you, and it needed to come out. That's what real artists do." A young man approached them hesitantly. He was one of the other waiters, someone Elena had worked with a few times before. His name was Diego, and he looked like he had just seen a miracle. "Elena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. How did you? I had no idea you could do that." Elena managed a small smile. "Neither did I. Not anymore, anyway." Diego shook his head in disbelief, then hurried away when Mr. Pearson called for the staff to resume service. Elena watched him go, suddenly aware of how strange this all was. An hour ago, she had been invisible. Now everyone in the room knew her face. Catherine touched her arm gently. "I need to leave soon, but I want you to call me. This week, if possible. I'm serious about what I said. There are opportunities for someone with your talent, scholarships, performance spots, teaching positions if that's what you prefer. But you need to make a choice." "What kind of choice?" "Whether you want to keep hiding," Catherine said, "or whether you're ready to be seen." She squeezed Elena's arm once, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like she had never been there at all. Elena stood alone by the piano, holding the business card in her hand. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Elena tried to go back to work, but Mr. Pearson told her to take the rest of the evening off. He didn't seem angry, just confused, like he was trying to figure out how someone so talented had ended up working for him. "You should have told me," he said at one point. "We could have. I don't know. Done something. I done something." Elena didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and went to collect her things. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. Elena stood on the steps of the country club, looking up at the stars. Her mother had loved the stars. She used to say that each one was a note in a song the universe was playing, too big and too beautiful for human ears to hear. Elena pulled out her phone and looked at the business card again. Catherine Ju, New York Philharmonic. It felt unreal, like something from a dream she would wake up from at any moment. Her phone buzzed. Then again. Then again. She looked at the screen and saw notifications flooding in. Texts from old friends she hadn't spoken to in years. Messages on social media from strangers. Emails from addresses she didn't recognize. One of the videos was already online. Someone had posted it with the caption, "Billionaire tries to embarrass waitress, gets the shock of his life." Elena watched the video with trembling hands. There she was, sitting at the piano, in her stained uniform, playing like her life depended on it. The comments were already piling up. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. She put the phone away and took a deep breath. For 10 years, she had told herself that her music was gone. That the girl who could have been something special had died along with her mother. That there was no point in dreaming about a life that would never be hers. But tonight, that girl had come back, and now the whole world was watching. Elena looked at Catherine's card one more time. Then she put it carefully in her pocket, right next to her heart. She had a phone call to make. Elena made the call on Monday morning. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone twice before Catherine answered. "I was hoping you would call," Catherine said. Her voice was warm but businesslike. "Can you come to my office this afternoon? There's someone I want you to meet." 3 hours later, Elena found herself standing outside a tall building in Midtown Manhattan. She was wearing the nicest clothes she owned, which wasn't saying much. A simple black dress she had bought for her mother's funeral, paired with shoes that pinched her feet because she couldn't afford new ones. She almost turned around and went home. What was she doing here? She was a waitress, a house cleaner, a nobody. These people lived in a different world. A world of concert halls and standing ovations, and careers built on talent and connections. She didn't belong here. But then she thought about her mother. She thought about all those years of sacrifice, all those hours spent teaching Elena to play, all those dreams that had been put on hold and eventually forgotten. Her mother had believed in her when no one else did. Walking away now would be like betraying that memory. So Elena took a deep breath and walked inside. Catherine's office was on the 14th floor. It was smaller than Elena expected, cluttered with stacks of sheet music and framed photographs of musicians Elena recognized from album covers and concert programs. Catherine was sitting behind a wooden desk, and across from her was a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. "Elena," Catherine said, standing up to greet her. "This is Bernard Hoffman. He's the conductor of the New York Philharmonic." Elena felt her knees go weak. Bernard Hoffman was a legend. She had listened to his recordings countless times during her years at the conservatory. He had conducted orchestras all over the world, worked with the greatest musicians of his generation, and won awards that most people could only dream of. And now he was looking at her like she was the most interesting person in the room. "I saw the video," Bernard said, his voice deep and gentle. "I must have watched it 20 times. Catherine tells me you studied at the Manhattan Conservatory." Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Why did you leave?" It was the same question Catherine had asked, and Elena gave the same answer. Her mother's illness. The medical bills. The impossible choice between her dreams and her family. Bernard listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Life has a way of testing us," he finally said. "It takes the things we love and forces us to prove how much they mean to us. Some people break under that pressure. Others come back stronger." He leaned forward slightly. "Which one are you?" Elena didn't know how to answer. She had spent so many years just trying to survive that she hadn't thought about what kind of person she was becoming. She only knew that she was tired. Tired of struggling, tired of being invisible, tired of pretending that the music inside her didn't exist. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I want to find out." Bernard smiled. It was a warm smile, the kind that made you feel like everything might actually be okay. "Good answer," he said. Over the next few weeks, Elena's life changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. Catherine arranged for her to audition at several music schools, and within a month, she had been offered a full scholarship to finish her degree. Not just any scholarship, but a special program designed for exceptional talents who had been forced to interrupt their studies. She quit her jobs at the diner and the country club. It was terrifying, giving up the steady income she had relied on for so long. But Catherine's foundation provided a small living stipend, enough to cover rent and basic expenses while Elena focused on her music. The first few months were brutal. Elena had forgotten how demanding serious practice could be. Her fingers, softened by years away from the piano, developed blisters that turned into calluses. Her back ached from hours spent hunched over the keyboard. Some nights she collapsed into bed so exhausted she couldn't even dream. But slowly, piece by piece, note by note, the music came back to her. It wasn't easy. There were days when Elena wanted to quit, when the gap between where she was and where she needed to be felt impossible to cross. She would sit at the piano and hear all the mistakes, all the imperfections, all the rust that had accumulated during her years away. Her professors pushed her hard, harder than anyone had ever pushed her before. They saw her potential and refused to let her settle for anything less than her best. Meanwhile, the video from the country club continued to spread. It had been viewed millions of times now, shared on every social media platform imaginable. News outlets picked up the story. Waitress, humiliated by billionaire. Turns out to be piano prodigy. The most inspiring video you'll see all year. Hidden genius. The story of Elena Vasquez. I-teen. Waitress humiliated. The story of Elena Vasquez. Elena tried to ignore the attention, but it was impossible. Reporters wanted interviews. Producers wanted to make documentaries. Talk shows wanted her to appear and tell her story. She said no to all of them. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Richard Harrington, on the other hand, couldn't escape the spotlight. The video had turned him into a symbol of everything wrong with the wealthy elite. Arrogant, cruel, dismissive of people he considered beneath him. His company's stock dropped. Business partners distanced themselves. His face became a meme, frozen in that moment of shock when he realized the waitress he had mocked was more talented than anyone in the room. Elena heard that he had tried to get ahead of the story by releasing a public apology. It was carefully worded, written by professionals, designed to minimize the damage. He expressed regret for his behavior and announced a donation to a music education charity. Most people didn't buy it. They could see it for what it was. Damage control. Nothing more. Elena didn't care about Richard's apology or his donation. She had already moved on. She had bigger things to focus on. 6 months after the night at the country club, Bernard Hoffman called her into his office. He was sitting behind his desk with a strange expression on his face, something between excitement and nervousness. "There's been a cancellation," he said. "One of our featured soloists for next month's concert had to withdraw due to illness. We need someone to fill the spot." He paused. "I want it to be you." Elena stared at him. "Next month? At Carnegie Hall?" Bernard nodded. "The program is already set. Chopin's Piano Concerto, No. 1. I seem to remember you have some experience with Chopin." Elena felt like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. Carnegie Hall, the most famous concert venue in the world. The place where legends had performed, where careers were made, and dreams came true. "I'm not ready," she heard herself say. "No one ever feels ready," Bernard replied. "But you are. I've watched you grow these past 6 months. You've worked harder than anyone I've ever seen. You've earned this. Elena, the only question is whether you're willing to take it." Elena thought about her mother. She thought about those years of struggle, those nights spent crying alone in her tiny apartment, those moments when she was sure the music was gone forever. She thought about the waitress who had stood in that ballroom, champagne stains on her uniform, being mocked by a man who thought he was better than her. And she thought about the woman she was becoming, the woman who had clawed her way back from nothing, the woman who refused to let her dreams die. "I'll do it," she said. Bernard smiled. "I know you will." 4 weeks. She had 4 weeks to prepare for the most important performance of her life. Elena went home that night and sat at her piano. She placed her fingers on the keys and closed her eyes. Then she began to practice. The night of the concert arrived faster than Elena thought possible. 4 weeks of practice, 4 weeks of barely sleeping, 4 weeks of pushing herself harder than she had ever pushed before. And now she was standing backstage at Carnegie Hall, listening to the murmur of 2,000 people waiting on the other side of the curtain. Her hands were trembling. Her mouth was dry. She felt like she might throw up, or faint, or both at the same time. A stagehand approached her with a bottle of water. 5 minutes, Miss Vasquez. Elena nodded but couldn't speak. She took a small sip of water and tried to steady her breathing. She thought about running. Just turning around and walking out the back door. Disappearing into the New York night. Leaving all of this behind. No one would blame her. She was just a waitress who got lucky, wasn't she? She didn't belong here with the real musicians, the real artists, the people who had spent their whole lives preparing for moments like this. But then she felt something in her pocket. A small photograph, worn and creased from years of being carried everywhere. She pulled it out and looked at it. It was a picture of her mother, taken years ago in their tiny apartment in Caracas. Her mother was sitting at the old second-hand piano, smiling at the camera with that warm, proud smile Elena remembered so well. On her lap sat a little girl with messy hair and bright eyes. Elena, at age 7, the day of her first recital. Her mother had written something on the back of the photograph. Elena had read it so many times she knew it by heart. But she read it again now, needing to hear her mother's voice in her head. Music is never lost, Mija. It just waits for the right moment to be heard. I believe in you. Always. Elena pressed the photograph to her heart and closed her eyes. I'm scared, Mama, she whispered. And somewhere, in a place beyond words and reason, she felt her mother whisper back. I know, Mija. But you were born for this. The stagehand appeared again. It's time. Elena tucked the photograph back into her pocket, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the light. The applause when she stepped onto the stage was polite, curious. Most of the audience had heard of her by now. The waitress from the viral video. The hidden genius. But hearing about someone and seeing them perform were two different things. They were waiting to see if the stories were true. Elena walked to the grand piano at the center of the stage. It was the most beautiful instrument she had ever seen, gleaming black under the bright lights. Behind her, the full orchestra sat ready, their instruments poised. Bernard Hoffman stood at the conductor's podium, his baton raised. He caught her eye and gave her a small nod. You can do this. Elena sat down on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys. The concert hall fell silent. 2,000 people held their breath. She looked out at the audience. The lights were too bright for her to see individual faces, but she knew who was out there. Catherine Jo, sitting in the third row. The woman who had changed everything. Her younger brother Miguel, who had flown in from California, using money Elena had finally been able to send him after years of struggling. Her old professors from the conservatory, some of whom had cried when they heard she was returning to music, and somewhere in the back, sitting alone in the last row, was a man who had bought his ticket under a false name and told no one he was coming. Richard Harrington had tried to stay away. He had told himself it would be inappropriate, that his presence would only cause problems. But something kept pulling him back to this moment. To this woman he had tried to humiliate almost a year ago. He didn't understand it fully. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was something deeper. A need to witness what happened when you underestimated someone so completely. So he sat in the shadows and waited, like everyone else. Bernard raised his baton. The orchestra began to play the opening notes of Chopin's Piano Concerto. No. 1. The music swelled, filling the great hall with sound, and then Elena began to play. From the first note, everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something special. It wasn't just the technical skill, though that was remarkable. It wasn't just the precision, though every note was exactly where it needed to be. It was something else, something harder to define. Elena played like she was having a conversation with someone only she could see. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying gently with the music, her face shifting between joy and sorrow, and everything in between. She played like the piano was an extension of her soul, like the music had been living inside her all along, and was finally being set free. In the third row, Catherine wiped tears from her eyes. She had heard thousands of performances in her career. She had worked with the greatest musicians of her generation. But she had never heard anything quite like this. Miguel watched his sister with wonder. He remembered Elena teaching him simple songs when they were children, her patient hands guiding his clumsy fingers. He remembered the day she left for America, promising she would send for him when she could. He remembered the years of silence, the phone calls that grew shorter and sadder, the sister who seemed to fade a little more each time they spoke. But the woman on that stage wasn't faded. She was blazing. In the back row, Richard Harrington sat frozen in his seat. His throat was tight. His eyes were burning. He thought about that night at the country club. He thought about the cruel words he had spoken, the laughter he had invited at her expense. He thought about who he had been in that moment, and who he had become in the months since. The public shaming had been brutal. His reputation had taken hits he was still recovering from. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted inside him. He had started actually reading about the charities he donated to, instead of just writing checks. He had started listening to his employees, instead of just giving orders. He had started, slowly and painfully, to become a better man. He didn't know if it was enough. He didn't know if anything would ever be enough to make up for the person he used to be. But sitting here, listening to this woman pour her heart out through that piano, he understood something important. She hadn't destroyed him that night. She had saved him. The concerto reached its final movement. Elena's fingers flew across the keys, the music building to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls of the concert hall. The orchestra surged behind her, every musician playing at the peak of their abilities, lifted by the force of her performance. And then, with one last, triumphant chord, it was over. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Then the audience exploded. People leaped to their feet. They cheered, they clapped, they cried. The applause was deafening, rolling through the hall like thunder. Flowers were thrown onto the stage. People called out her name. Elena stood slowly, her legs shaking. She looked out at the sea of faces. All of them turned toward her. All of them shining with tears, and joy, and amazement. She thought about the waitress who had stood in that ballroom, champagne stains on her uniform, being told she was nothing. She thought about the girl who had given up her dreams to care for her dying mother. She thought about all the years of struggle, all the nights of crying, all the moments when she was sure the music was gone forever. And she thought about her mother, watching from somewhere beyond the stars, finally seeing her daughter become everything she had always known she could be. Elena raised her hand to her heart, where the photograph still rested in her pocket. "This was for you, Mama," she whispered. Then she bowed to the audience, and the applause washed over her like a wave of light. She had been lost for so long. But now, finally, she was found, and the whole world could hear her music.